Okay. So San Jacinto, uh, the a portion of the Mexican army is defeated. I think I talked about this in the podcast last week, but I do want to repeat. The Mexican army, if it had been ably led, could have still defeated the Texans, the Texas Revolution. There were still more Mexican soldiers in Mexican Texas after San Jacinto than there were Texans. Um, but what happens is, and this is one of the things that drove Pena just absolutely crazy, and it's one of the reasons he wanted to write this account of the Texas campaign. Remember, it's an expose of Santa Anna. That's the whole point of the Pena so-called diary. What happens is that Santa Anna is captured a day or so after San Jacinto. He dresses in, there's all kinds of stories, but he probably dressed in the uniform of maybe a Mexican private, something like that, a Mexican soldier who was private. But nonetheless, he was captured. And the Texas officials at the time, Sam Houston and the other officials, were smart. Most of the Texas Army wanted to just kill him. Because they're so angry at the Alamo and Goliad. And Goliad was a war crime. I would not say the Alamo was really a war crime. It was a battle. I think the execution of Davy Crockett and a couple of his followers, that was a war crime. But there's no doubt that Goliad was a war crime. It was the mass murder of up to 300 people who had surrendered. Anyway. But the Texans realized, the Texas officials after San Jacinto, that Santa Anna is worth more to them alive than he is dead. And that was actually smart. And one of the things that Santa Anna does very quickly is he orders the two Mexican generals that remained in Texas, a general named Urrea, Urrea is how you spell his name, General Urrea, and General Filosola, Filosola, and Crisp talks about these two generals. General Urrea was actually the most effective Mexican officer in the Texas Revolution. He had come up through Matamoros. He had led a detachment or an element of the Mexican army that didn't come through Nuevo Laredo or Eagle Pass through San Antonio. He had come up from Matamoros. Elements of his troops had captured Goliad. Urrea was not involved in the massacre at Goliad. It was a colonel, Portilla, I think his name was the man on the spot and ordered the men executed. Santa Anna ordered the men executed, and then I think this guy Portilla was the one that followed Santa Anna's orders. So, long story short, Urrea's hands are clean when it comes to this massacre. And then Filosola, Pena hated Filosola because Filosola was the commanding officer of the Mexican army after the capture of Santa Anna. And remember, Santa Anna is both the commander of the Mexican army and the president of Mexico. So he still has, at least for the time being, until he's stripped by the Mexican people, he still has both political and military power. So Santa Anna orders the Mexican army to retreat south of the Rio Grande. And Filosola and Urrea meet and decide whether or not to obey this order. And it's very interesting, if they had disobeyed Santa Anna, if they had pulled the elements of the Mexican army that still remained, that had not been killed or captured at the Battle of San Jacinto, then who knows what would have happened in 1836. The war certainly would have continued, but we don't know. What happened is Filosola, much to the rage of Pena, obeys Santa Anna's order. And he orders General Filosola, orders the famous Mar de Lodo, which was the March of Mud, or the Sea of Mud, I should say, march all the way back across the Rio Grande. It was just horrific for the Mexican army, the Mexican soldiers. They're marching, it's a very wet spring of 1836. There's no roads, really, and they've got this artillery, and it's just kind of a nightmare. And Pena, one of the things that he wants to do in his expose, he wants to expose Filosola as the real gutless general that if he should have disobeyed Santa Anna and should have continued the fight. against the Texans, but Filipsola didn't. He obeyed Santa Anna, and he retreated back into Mexico. So this is another part of the story that Peña wants to tell, and he is, again, he's just furious at the actions of his leaders. He's furious at the way the Battle of the Alamo was fought, not waiting for the artillery, the execution of Crockett he thought was completely immoral. He was horrified by the mass murder at Goliad, and then he's just enraged by this retreat of the Mexican army in the face of inferior numbers. So Peña's just beside himself with what went on in Texas. And as a Mexican patriot, why shouldn't he be? As I've said many times, the loss of Texas was a disaster for the Mexican nation, just an utter and complete disaster that you could argue that Mexico hasn't recovered from fully to this day, although worse was to come in terms of Mexico losing California, Arizona, New Mexico, etc. The first big loss was Texas, and it kind of sets the tone for other losses. Okay, so long story short, I think I've said that twice now. Maybe I should just say long story long. But anyway, so Texas now is under the rule of an Anglo regime after San Jacinto. The Tejanos, who had ruled Texas really since the 17 teens, they still have a voice in the Texas government for a little bit less than a decade. Some, like Seguin, serve in the Texas Congress, but the clock is ticking on these folks. As my friend Raul Ramos says in his book, within a decade, Tejanos will be considered a despised minority in Texas, especially as more and more Anglos are coming into Texas. The folks that came into Texas after 1836, probably upwards to 90%, came from slave-holding regions. If you look at the image I have up, if you can see it, but you kind of know this intuitively, Texas was surrounded by slave-holding states, Louisiana, Arkansas. You go a little bit further east, Mississippi, Alabama, Tennessee. So Texas was very, very deep into the slave-holding, remember, it's not part of the United States yet, but it neighbors a very, very intense portion in terms of slavery, part of the United States. And the other thing is that the folks coming into Texas, for the most part, are trying to make money off the cotton trade. Either growing cotton, which meant slave labor, and I can't say this enough, that the cultivation of cotton, the production of cotton, and slave labor went completely hand in hand. They were super tightly integrated. It was almost unheard of. In fact, I can say it was unheard of that anybody would think about growing cotton to any large extent without slaves. They were just seen as two sides of the same coin. You can't grow cotton without slaves. And as I've said before in class, the thinking is that you grow cotton to buy slaves, you buy slaves to grow cotton. They're completely intertwined. So the folks that are coming into Texas, very much interested, and after 1836, of course, they don't have, there's no barriers, legal barriers anyway, to Americans bringing their slaves into Texas. The Republic of Texas was really welcomed slaveholders to come into Texas. They were very happy that when they came. So, it's no longer Mexico. And what you have with Texas, it's very, very interesting. Texas becomes the last, maybe the first, but definitely the last slave-holding nation in the world. It's almost, you might want to think of it as like a banana republic, except it's a cotton republic. It's a nation that's based on, largely, the economy is based on the cultivation of one crop, cotton. So when Texas becomes an independent nation, what it stakes its fortune on and what it stakes its future on is being a slave-holding nation whose economy is overwhelmingly based on the production of cotton. Now, you might say, well, the United States was a slaveholding nation too, which is true in a sense, but think about it. The U.S. had a slaveholding section, from Louisiana, Alabama, Mississippi, all the way up to South Carolina, or I'm sorry, all the way up to Virginia, actually Delaware. But also there was a large segment of the United States, and a very dynamic and growing segment of the United States, that slavery didn't exist in. Right? So the U.S. wasn't completely a slaveholding nation. It was a nation that had slavery as part of its economy. It was a significant part. It was the wealthiest part of the economy, but it wasn't everything. In Texas, the Republic of Texas, when it comes online in 1836, and during its brief existence, it's completely a slaveholding nation. There's no parts of Texas where slavery doesn't exist. So that's one of the interesting things about Texas, that it's the first and the last of a completely slaveholding nation in the world. And the timing for Texas, and I'll develop this over the next couple of weeks, the timing for Texas was horrible, because at the same time you've got this growth, the global growth of cotton, production of cotton, you're also having the growth in the abolitionist movement. Those folks who were determined to kill slavery. And the abolitionist movement was an international movement as well. So Texas comes online in an interesting moment. It's a moment where cotton, there's almost an insatiable desire for cotton, although the price of cotton would go up and down. And so the world markets are, for the most part, ready for Texas cotton. But at the same time, Texas becomes a slaveholding nation at a time when the globe is starting to oppose slavery, many areas of the world. And a good example of this is Great Britain. There was slavery not in Great Britain, but in British territories like Jamaica, and the Caribbean, up until the 1830s. But in 1838, almost exactly the time that Texas becomes an independent nation, Great Britain ended slavery in the Caribbean. Actually, Great Britain abolished slavery in all of its territories, because this abolitionist movement in Great Britain had become so powerful. Now, Great Britain, its hands are in our. It's a very complicated story, which I can't really get into. But what I can get into for Texas history is, and I'll end the podcast, this particular podcast, I have some more on this note. At the time that Texas becomes a slaveholding republic is at a time when abolition is growing stronger and stronger. And in particular, and most notably, Great Britain has ended slavery in its colonies in the Caribbean. So in some ways, the timing of Texas is both great, but it's also horrible.